Namaskar students. Today we will move into our lecture 35. This is the second lecture on the theories of international cooperation and integration. We started this theory in the last lecture and we are continuing with all the other schools within this. So today we will be going into what is called what are transactions and communication. Carl Duché studied the process by which political communities are formed with a major emphasis in his work on the development of indicators based on communication patterns and transaction flows. Communications among people can produce either friendship or hostility, depending on the extent to which the memories of communications are associated with more or less favorable conditions. Political systems endure as a result of their ability to abstract and to code incoming information into appropriate symbols, to store coded symbols, to disassociate certain important information from the rest, to recall stored information when needed, and to recombine stored information entered as an input into the system. The building of political inputs or units depends upon the flow of communications within the unit and between the unit and the outside world. Integration theory, NATO, because one of the first organizations that Carl Duché studied was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Duché's major substantive contribution, published in 1957, examined 10 cases of integration and disintegration at the international level, national level. There are similarities between the process of community building at the national level and doing so beyond the nation state. Two kinds of security communities were suggested by Duché. One, amalgamated, in which previously independent units had formed a single unit with a common government, and pluralistic, in which separate governments retained legal independence. Conditions for the creation of an amalgamated security community: mutual compatibility of major values, a distinctive way of life, expectations of joint rewards, timed so as to come before the imposition of burdens from amalgamation, a marked increase in political and administrative capabilities of at least some participating units, superior economic growth on the part of some of the members, and the development of so-called core areas around which are grouped comparatively weaker units, unbroken links of social communication, both geographically between territories and between different social strengths. And if you see, there is also multiplicity of communications and transactions. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, seen as one of the most successful security communities, not only during the Cold War, even during now, present times and post-Cold War period, has not become an amalgamated security community. Its members nevertheless had developed a conception of security community in which there is a real assurance that members of that community will not fight each other physically, but will settle their disputes in some other way. Rising tensions between Greece and Turkey, both NATO members, did not go to war, a large pluralistic security community. As a community of states with democratic political systems, NATO members have developed practices and normative standards placing a high premium on the settlement of international disputes by peaceful means. Conditions for the formation of a pluralistic security community: compatibility of values among decision makers, mutual predictability of behavior among decision makers of units to be integrated, and mutual responsiveness, the ability to work closely together in timely fashion to address pressing issues. Conditions for disintegration. 1. Extended military commitments on the part of the unit. 2. An increase in political participation by a previously passive group. 3. The growth of ethnic and linguistic differentiation. 4. Prolonged economic decline or stagnation. 5. Relative closure of political elites to new groups seeking greater political power and participation. Excessive delay in social, economic, and political reforms, and failure of a formerly privileged group to adjust to its loss of dominance. Integration theory, the European Union. This has been the other successful union integration process in the real international world. Evolution of the European Economic Community from the Single European Act SEA of 1986 and the Treaty of the European Union TEU signed in Maastricht in Netherlands in 1991 and the Amsterdam Treaty of 1998 has provided the basis for theory extending beyond neo-functionalism. The SEA set a goal since attained the end of 1992 as the date for completing the internal market or the removal of barriers to commerce within the European Union. The TEU, or the Treaty of the European Union, which came into operation in 1993, extended qualified majority voting procedures in the Council of Ministers and established the framework for a common foreign and security policy together with a phased movement towards monetary union. European Union. Nevertheless, the TEU remained largely unfulfilled in the 1990s, and there were several challenges in the form of referenda against it in Denmark and narrowly for it in France, deepening debates and reservations in the UK, and legal challenges in Germany and UK. The focal point of the debate about European integration has been between the proponents of a supranational Europe and the supporters of European integration built upon the foundations of the nation state, and in particular, intergovernmental cooperation. The leading proponent of the supranational approach has been Jean Monnet, who played a seminal role in the institutional architecture for the ECSC and the European Union. The intergovernmental approach was closely identified with the policies of President Charles de Gaulle of France and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of the UK. European Union. Throughout the evolution of the European Union, whatever the role of the supranational institutions, the support of national governments has been indispensable. Those governments of the greatest importance have been included Germany, France, and UK, a kind of Korean. Conjunction of events, including the expansion of the EU membership, agreements on contributions by the UK to the EU budgets, the growing pressures on Western Europe from the world economy, leading to impetus for deregulation, transnational mergers, and increased access to internal European markets and political trends within member states. European Union. The EU has not evolved in accordance with the neo-functionalist or the functionalist transfer of power to supranational institutions. Instead, the EU represents a pooling or sharing of sovereignty in which the national governments retain a dominant decision-making role. The community has a highly complex policy-making process in which formal and informal institutions at different levels in the formal structure, if in the formal structure at all, are linked by a variety of networks. SEA, Andrew Moravcsik and Daniel Cameron. SEA provides evidence of an integrative process based on intergovernmental institutionalism characterized by intergovernmental initiatives agreed on by the heads of state of the European Union states, based on negotiations and compromises reflecting the domestic constraints, pressures, and interests that each head brings to the table. Germany, France, and UK, as the largest of the EU members, have such great influence in the bargaining process that the resulting agreement represents their minimum common ground, with the exception of situations in which two of the largest members threaten to exclude the third. The member states, far from becoming peripheral to the supranational evolution of the institutions, place explicit limits on the transfer of sovereignty to the European Union. SCA David Cameron, he contends that neo-functionalism and intergovernmentalism each provide the basic synthesis about the integration process. In keeping with neo-functionalist theory, he observed substantial efforts on the part of the domestic groups, especially business, to lobby to the supranational level, bypassing national governments. At the same time, the intergovernmental dimension of the neorealist state as actor was present in the form of national interests, perspectives, and preferences that were reflected in the integrative process. Thus, the European Council, the intergovernmental institutional manifestation of the European community, and the executive, making it possible for member states to act collectively, not only to accelerate, but also control economic integration and supranational institution building. Wayne Sandholtz and John Zysman. Post-World War II integration movement was the outgrowth of international structural changes, shifts in the global economy since the 1970s heightened the need for further European integration, reflected in the SCA and the MAKIAS Treaty. As a process, economic integration proceeds as a result of a hierarchy of bargains in which domestic political elites reach agreement on basic objectives, followed by subsidiary bargains designed to achieve the agreed goals, institutional manifestations of such bargains. The impetus to it from Europe came from essentially four groups: individual elites, large corporations, governments, and the EU institutions. Integration process, a stop and go pattern, rocky pattern, both achievements and setbacks. Problems encountered in establishing the Economic and Monetary Union, EMU, the European Central Bank, and the single currency, euro, illustrate quite well the uncertainties that beset the integrative process. The British contended that the next major step in the EU integration should be to widen before deepening. That meant bringing in the new democratic countries to the east before adopting a single currency. Paradoxically, Britain fought rearguard action to obstruct some of the very reforms deemed essential perquisites to enlargement. And here the issue of Turkey has always been there with the European Union, which has been quite controversial. LAGGARD state, threatening to leave if its demands are not met. Such a state poses its exist threat conditions of uncertainty based on imperfect information, and the integrationist majority cannot be certain of the LAGGARD actual intention. It can push its threat to gain the most favorable terms possible from those members seeking to preserve the integrated entity. France, UK, and Denmark have used threats that often included full or partial exit to attain their goals. The threat that the UK Parliament would not approve the MAASTRICHT Treaty if objectionable provisions on social policy were included gave UK negotiators bargaining leverage in the negotiations. The information uncertainty about domestic support or opposition, including the possibility that a government even less committed to integration may come to office, enhances the LAGGARD state's negotiating position. European Union. The EU is a political and economic union of 27 members that is located primarily in Europe. The EU and the European citizenship were established when MAKIAS Treaty came into force in 1993. The EU traces its origins to the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, and the European Economic Community, EEC, respectively by the 1951 Treaty of Paris and the 1957 Treaty of Rome. The original members of what came to be known as the European communities were inner six: Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. The communities and their successors have grown in size by the accession of new member states and in power by the addition of policy areas to their remit. The latest major amendment to the constitutional basis of the EU is the Treaty of Lisbon, came into force in 2009. On 31st January 2020, the United Kingdom became the first member state to leave the EU. Following the 2016 referendum, the UK signified its intention to leave and negotiated a withdrawal agreement. The MAKIAS Treaty 1992 to 2007. The European Union was formally established when the MAKIAS Treaty, whose main architects were Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand, came into force on 1st November 1993. The treaty also gave the name European Community to the EEC, even if it was referred to as such before the treaty. With further enlargement planned to include the former communist states of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as Cyprus and Malta, the Copenhagen criteria for candidate members to join the EU were agreed upon in June 1993. The expansion of the EU introduced a new level of complexity, and in 1995, Austria, Finland, and Sweden joined the EU. In 2002, euro banknotes and coins replaced national currencies in 12 of the member states. Since then, the eurozone has increased to encompass 19 countries. The euro currency became the second largest reserve currency in the world. In 2004, the EU saw its biggest enlargement to date when Cyprus and the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined the Union. Lisbon Treaty 2007 to the present. In 2007, Bulgaria and Romania became members. The same year, Slovenia adopted the euro, followed in 2008 by Cyprus and Malta, by Slovenia in 2009, by Estonia in 2011, by Latvia in 2014, and by Lithuania in 2015. On 1st December 2009, the Lisbon Treaty entered into force and reformed many aspects of the EU. In particular, it changed the legal structure of the European Union, merging the EU three-pillar systems into a single legal entity provisioned with the legal personality, created a permanent president of the European Council, the first of which was Herman Van Rompuy, and strengthened the position of the High Representative of the Union and Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. In 2012, the EU received the Nobel Peace Prize for having contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy, and human rights in Europe. In 2013, Croatia became the 28th EU member. From the beginning of the 2010s, the cohesion of the European Union has been tested by several issues, including the debt crisis in some of the Eurozone countries, increasing migration from Asia and Africa, and the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union. Please excuse me. A referendum in the UK on its membership of the European Union was held in 2016, with 51.9% of the participants voting to leave. the UK formally notified the European Council of its decision to leave on 29 March 2017, initiating the formal withdrawal procedure of leaving and extensions to the process. The UK left the European Union on 31st January 2020. So most areas of the European Union law will continue to apply to the UK for a transition period lasting until the end of 2020 at the earliest. Impact of EU. The European Union has had a significant positive economic impact on most member states. According to a 2019 study of the member states joined from 1973 to 2004, without European integration, per capita incomes would have been, on average, approximately 10% lower in the first 10 years after joining the European Union. Greece was the exception reported by the study, which analyzed up to 2008 to avoiding confounding effects from the global financial crisis. The European Union has contributed to peace in Europe, in particular by pacifying border disputes and to the spread of democracy, especially by encouraging democratic reforms in aspiring Eastern European member states after the collapse of the USSR. Scholar Thomas Rees wrote in 2009, there is a consensus in the literature on East Europe that the EU membership perspective has a huge anchoring effects for the new democracies. However, R. Daniel Kahneman argues that over time the European Union has proved beneficial to leaders who are overseeing democratic backsliding as the EU is reluctant to intervene in domestic politics, gives authoritarian governments funds which they can use to strengthen their regimes. And because freedom of movement within the EU allows dissenting citizens to leave their backsliding countries, thus weakening their domestic influence. International regimes. John Ruggie introduced this concept in 1975. International regime is a set of mutually accepted rules and regulations, plans, organizational and financial commitments that have been accepted by a group of states. Different types of regimes may yield different solutions to the same problems. The result is differences in cooperative outcomes depending on the nature of the institutional structure that constitutes the international regime. International regimes encompass issue areas as diverse as defense, trade, monetary policy, law, and food policy. Such entities are to represent efforts within the international system to develop collaborative arrangements by either formal or informal means. When we talk about regime theory, the name that is very important is that of Stephen Krasner. Stephen Krasner defined as regime as principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which the actor expectations converge in a given issue area. Regimes categories according to functions, continuum extending from specific to single issue or to a diffuse multi-issue level. International regimes have been said to consist of intervening variables standing between basic causal factors and on the one hand and outcomes and behavior on the other. Principles represent beliefs of fact, causation, and rectitude. Norms are standards of behavior defined in terms of rights and obligations. Rules are specific prescriptions or prescriptions for action. Decision-making procedures are prevailing practices for making and implementing collective choices. Oran Young. Regimes consist of social institutions governing the areas those interested in specific activities or meaningful selected activities, with a core element of regimes lying in the field of rights and rules that are more or less extensive or formally articulated. Some such institutional arrangements will structure the opportunities of actors interested in a given activity, and the exact content will be a matter of intense interest to these actors. Learning may lead actors to alter the means used to achieve a desired end, or learning may even result in changed objectives. Inquiry focuses on questions associated with how and why regimes are established and what organizational or structural form they take, along with the process by which decisions are made within them and the resulting outputs, together with the changes in international behavior that regimes may initiate or help to achieve. Formal and informal. Regimes may be formal in nature, or they may consist of informal arrangements. Formal regimes may be the result of legislation, international organizations. Such regimes possess governing councils and bureaucratic structures. Informal regimes may be based simply on a consensus of objectives and mutual interests among participants, resulting in ad hoc agreements. Regimes may be based on common interest in which collaboration represents an optimal energy for participants. At the minimum, collaboration entails agreed rules to work together for certain goals and abstain from certain actions. Ernest has common aversion. In such regimes, the actors do not agree to a jointly preferred outcome, but they do on the outcome all wish to avoid. Such regimes merely require policy coordination, not collaboration. Regimes may result from voluntary collaboration or cooperation. They may be based on the imposed will of a dominant power. Thus, we may speak of colonial or imperial regimes, or a commodity agreement which weaker states must sign to qualify for other economic benefits. Types: Oronyang, negotiated regimes characterized by explicit consent on the part of the participants. Imposed regimes that are deliberately established by dominant actors who succeed in getting others to the requirements of those orders through some combination of coercion, cooperation, and manipulation of incentives. Regimes may come into existence as a result of an agreement or a contract among the participants. Alternatively, regimes may be created either in evolutionary fashion or in a dramatic unilateral action by one party that is accepted by others. Actors who have formed one regime may engage in a process of task expansion or spillover that will lead over time to the emergence of a more comprehensive and coherent regime. Hegemonic stability, cooperation, and collaboration. Regimes may be the result of a direct imposition of institutional arrangements. Subordinate elements coerced into compliance. Imperial and feudal systems are said to be illustrative of such regimes. A dominant power may exert leadership in the formation and preservation of regimes that serve its interests, but are also widely accepted in the international system. Johann defines hegemony as a possession of a preponderance of material sources, raw materials, capital, control of markets, and a competitively advantageous position in the production of goods in great demand. Cooperation after hegemony. At a time when the hegemonic power has declined in power and influence, the regimes are more easily preserved and created. Johann, cooperation is possible after hegemony. He's talking about the United States post-1970s. Not only because of the conditions for maintaining existing regimes are less demanding than those required for creating them. International regimes depend for their existence on perceived interests that are common and complementary in nature. As the hegemonic power's position is diminished, a growth of interaction among at least a few of the units of the regime may serve as a replacement or supplement, leading to a post-hegemonic cooperation. International regimes have their interests. The greater the incentive to cooperation, the more likely it is that such regimes will survive the decline of the hegemonic power. Distinction between cooperation and harmony. Kyohin. Harmony is illustrated by the situation in which the power's self-interest by all actors leads automatically to the actors of all the participants' goals, much as in the case of the harmony of interest concepts. International regimes, especially those lacking formal structures, may be based on harmony, as with market competition of the invisible hand of a classical economics model. Cooperation represents a condition in which the actor participation takes steps to adapt their behavior to the needs of others by means of a process of policy coordination. Harmony may exist even in the absence of communications among actors. Cooperation in political in nature, because it requires adjustment on the part of participants to the needs and interests of each other. Cooperation does not assure the conflict is absent from the relationship. Instead, cooperation forms either a reaction to existing conflict or part of a conflict to avoid a future conflict. Kyohin tells us that harmony may exist even in the absence of commitment among actors. Cooperation in is political in nature because it requires adjustment on the part of the participants to the needs and interests of each other. Cooperation does not assure that conflict is absent from the relationship. Instead, cooperation forms either a reaction to existing conflict or part of an effort to avoid future conflict. Excuse me, please. The international regime concept enhances our ability both to describe and to account for patterns of cooperation and to understanding the basis for discord over a period of time. By investigating the evolution of the norms and rules of regime over time, we can use the concept of international regime both to explore continuity and to investigate change in the world political economy. Regime theory and neorealism. The emphasis of regime analysis is the state actor, inasmuch as regimes evolve within the international system in which power is diffused or concentrated. Regimes are found in international systems in which there is a broadly based distribution of capabilities, a balance of power among large number of states. Such hegemonic powers create a basis for peace and stability. By furnishing rewards for cooperative behavior, they contribute to the formation of international regimes. To the extent that its focus is state-centric, the regime concept draws and contributes to neorealist theory. International behavior is based principally on interests and power, and that world politics is anarchic. It modifies such a conception. The regime concept is based on a calculus of benefits and costs, of perceived gains and risks inherent in complying with and violating the provisions, rules and procedures set forth by a given regime. Conclusion. The regime concept may be viewed in part as an attempt to refine the realist idea of national interest, encompass the notion that cooperation is explicable even on narrowly self-interested, egoistic assumptions about the actors in world politics. Regimes are said to arise as expectations converge on a new focal point that in turn furnishes the basis for new institutional arrangements. Deeply embedded in the concept of the idea of interdependence among the entities constituting the regime. The greater the level and range of interdependence, the more extensive would be will be the shared interest in cooperation or collaboration, and hence the need to use existing regimes to create new ones. Although such entities are creations of the state system, regimes exist as actors in themselves, assume a life of their own, because regimes function as intervening variables, alters the distribution of power among the entities that originally formed them, may contribute to strengthening or weakening the capabilities of their members by transferring resources from one unit to another. Criticism. Regime analysis contains several serious flaws, including an extensive emphasis on the states and an inadequate appreciation of the dynamic element of change at the international level. Its normative preoccupation is alleged to lie with the basis for order or for the status quo, rather than for concepts such as justice. The state-centric model is inadequate for study of the complex and rapidly changing international system. It has been faulted for its alleged lack of sufficient definitional precision. And if you see very clearly in this lecture, we have tried to move forward beyond functionalism and neo-functionalist schools that we did in the first lecture. In this lecture, we went into the Carl Duche's issue of transactions and communications, his study of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then we did a successful organization called the European Union. And from then, we moved on to the issue of regime theory. Regime theory is how international regimes were created in the absence of a hegemon, or when the hegemon refused to do it, and when there are nobody else to take over that. So in the next lecture, we will finish up with this theory of international cooperation and integration. Okay, thank you. Namaskar.